I'd like to welcome everybody to the very first episode of the Use Your Head podcast. Being episode number 1, I'm going to give you a brief background on what the podcast is supposed to be. Generally, this is just going to be an opportunity to go over topics and think about them logically. At this point in my life, I'm tired of things being so influenced by politics and other things like that. I don't think people anymore think critically. I think they always say, well, how does my side need to view this? And that's something that I'm certainly not going to be doing anymore. So I also enjoy researching topics. It's one of the ways that I learn new things, and kind of having a purpose with a podcast where I'm trying to get episodes out will automatically have me pick topics, and then I can just Google the crap out of them. I don't think any topic here is going to be taboo, so obviously anybody's welcome to suggest a topic at any time that they'd like to know more about. If I also find it interesting, I'll go ahead and put together a ton of research, and we can have fun learning about it. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and move right into the first topic. In regards to things that I've covered and thought about over the last few years, the topic of this first episode is probably the most impactful thing that I've ever done. And to give you a brief history, it's in regards to diet. Now, before we step any further, I got to get the disclaimers out of the way. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a nutritionist. I'm not any way associated with anything medical in any way, shape, or form. So the information I'm going to give you is researched to the best of my ability, but it can't be given any weight. So you've got to make decisions on your own, which is really how all of this should be anyway. Even if you go see a doctor, the amount of information that they're trying to keep up with is also overwhelming. So in every way, we should once again go back to the use your head kind of viewpoint and say, well, I'm going to get the information, think critically, and go from there. So I do suggest, if you've never been to a doctor and you're going to do a diet change, go to the doctor, have them evaluate what you're going to do. I'm not sure all doctors are going to be up to date with this, but at the same time, it never hurts to go ahead and get blood work. Now, have I done any of that before I ventured into my diet changes? Unfortunately not, so I'm a complete hypocrite. But for that matter, I also didn't go to the doctor when I was on my typical diet before, so for me, it's par for the course. But to go and get blood work done, just so you have a baseline of where you're at and where you're going, is really probably the way to go. You can track the goods and the bads, and be able to make logical and critical choices as you go. With all that said, I have tried to record this podcast a few times before, and it's always carried to over an hour. I've always attempted to be really technical and give as much scientific information as I possibly could, and I now realize, if I'm over an hour, it's probably not going to help anybody. I'm going to lose listeners, and people are just going to be, kind of moving on anyway. In this format, I'm not doing video at the same time, just because I, one, don't have the setup, and two, I don't think I'm ready to be sitting there with just a camera pointed in my face while I talk for an hour about different topics. So I've gone back, and instead of sitting with my big notebook that I have with all the information on it, I've gone over this diet idea in my head enough times. I'm just going directly from my head, and I thought, it's complicated enough. It would probably be beneficial. We can do like a question and answer, maybe live video one day on Facebook or YouTube, and people can just submit questions, because this is really a lot to take in. But I've decided I'm going to just put this into a couple different parts. First one's going to be to describe my original diet, which I would consider to be very typical to most other people, and I'm going to go over the some of the drawbacks and benefits to that diet, and then I'm going to go over my new diet now, and also any drawbacks and benefits that I get from that. I'm going to get into the metabolic processes a little bit, and we'll just kind of roll with it from there. So, for most people that know me personally, know that the diet I'm referencing is my switch over to the either consider it low carbohydrate or ketogenic diet. Are they the same? No. But I think I would consider them very closely parallel in regards to how the approach is made and everything else. So let's first get into why on earth would I have a diet change to begin with. I think it's fair for me to say that I had a diet before that was typical, and it's actually picked up a nickname these days. It's considered the typical Western diet. For me, what would that consist of? Well, you'd have breakfast, lunch, and dinner with snacks in between. Those food items would be anything from, let's see, in the morning, toast, eggs, muffins, pancakes, waffles. Lunch would include sandwiches with more bread, different varieties of bread, wheat bread, white bread, doesn't matter. Snacks would be, potato chips, Doritos. I've always been a candy addict, so inserted somewhere along there was always some sort of gummy candy, most likely. Swedish Fish, Mike and Ike's. Oh, they sound fantastic. But anyway, Pez, all like that. So, the bulk of it was, some protein, some fats. Did I worry about cholesterol? Absolutely. So I would often try to eat some things like oat and vegetables have always been a part of my diet, etc. So I would have some of that mixed in too. But, I think the reality is that probably at least half or a good portion of my diet intake was carbohydrates. To give an idea of how this works from a metabolic level then, is that my diet and anything even closely resembling a diet that is low in fat and higher in protein and carbohydrates runs off basically where your body metabolizes it and uses it as glucose. Doesn't particularly matter what you eat. Now, it does change from one format to another in regards to how fast things are digested, but essentially what we're talking about with a typical Western diet is everything you eat gets metabolized into the finished product of glucose. So glucose is simply a form of sugar. So your body runs off the glucose for everything from energy, brain energy, physical energy. And, if you eat, for example, a piece of fruit that is mostly fructose, your body will eventually turn that down to glucose. When you have table sugar, which is sucrose, which is actually just a combination of glucose and fructose, your body will eventually turn that into glucose. When you're having that piece of wheat bread, your body will obviously pass through the fiber, but the rest of the carbohydrates in it gets metabolized down to glucose. When you have that piece of chicken, the protein will eventually get broken down and through a different process that I won't get into here, will at least partially get turned into glucose. So all of these things lead into just the metabolic function of using glucose for energy. So with that said, what's the issue? Well, really all diets, no matter what I'm going to talk about for the rest of this podcast, really all come down to the same thing. And while calories are not all equal, calories from protein, calories from carbohydrates, and calories from fat are all a little different. Essentially, it all does come down to calories in, calories out. So if the diet I just referenced, you're familiar with it, and you're healthy, you look good, you feel good, if you're able to easily do the calories in, calories out with this diet and be exactly where you want to be, then, other than listening for your enjoyment, this podcast may not even be for you, this particular episode. because it's not the be-all, end-all that everybody out there has to switch to something different. However, in my case, as I said just a little bit ago, that I was a candy addict, and I was carrying way too much weight all around my stomach, and it was something that I didn't like, and I was hungry all the time, and it just wasn't something that I could see as being, something long-term for my overall health. I don't know where my blood markers were at, but I can make some assumptions now that I'm more educated on everything, that even though I tried to balance things out with vegetables and oats and things like that to help, reduce some of my blood markers, I'm almost positive that it didn't work. So for those that also are not particularly thrilled with how they feel or how they look or what their numbers are when they do go to the doctor, then I'd like you to consider the drawbacks. There are no specific benefits to a carbohydrate-based Western diet, so I'm going to skip right over that. Carbohydrates alone, there isn't a single body process that requires carbohydrates. You'll never hear anybody be slowly fading away from a carbohydrate deficiency. It doesn't exist. So to say that there's any kind of benefit, I'm not sure it's really there. Most of the benefits when people are eating a typical Western diet comes when they stumble upon the non-carbohydrate parts, the lean proteins, the fatty proteins, the vegetables, the fiber. All of that is the only time that I consider they're getting some sort of benefit from the diet, and that's not from the carbohydrates themselves. So what are some of the downsides? I would say even if you feel great, some of these still apply. But you've got really basics. You have tooth decay. So your mouth constantly being bathed in sugar from eating the carbohydrates, and most specifically refined carbohydrates that's in our waffles, breads, pancakes, etc., is an acidic environment that can lead to tooth decay, gum disease, etc. Not only directly from the carbohydrates themselves, from the sugars, but also messes up with mouth bacteria by feeding bacteria that you don't necessarily want to proliferate in your mouth and outcompeting healthy ones. It's called the typical Western diet because this all simply came about after the Industrial Revolution. Really, before then, most of the times we were tribal people, hunting, gathering, things like that. Once people started to settle down, we started to turn more towards more aggressive farming-based diets, and then obviously when the Industrial Revolution came, we had to figure out how to feed a lot of people in a short amount of time. So we went to really heavier farming and production of different things. So my point there is, when scientists, archaeologists find remains of older civilizations, they almost always have their teeth. And the big reason for that is because they weren't eating carbohydrate, sugar-based diets. So we got mouth issues out of the way. It starts to get a little bit more serious as we go. So the next two epidemics that would be considered are also easily traceable to only when Western civilization took over. We have heart disease and also diabetes. Now, for type 1 diabetes, your body, genetically, you're born without the ability to manufacture a chemical called insulin. So that has to be kind of taken to the side. However, there's a deeper epidemic, which is what most people have, is type 2 diabetes. This is where the body's production of insulin can no longer compete with the amount of sugar in the blood that needs to be converted. First, you lead to insulin resistance, and then you go into full-blown diabetes. So how sugar is involved with that is, as we consume carbohydrates, when that starts to be metabolized by the body, it triggers the insulin response, which is basically where your pancreas puts out insulin, and the purpose of insulin, to keep it short, is to open up the cell pathways to try to use that sugar, the glucose, as energy. Now the issue obviously becomes when we're taking in more sugar, glucose, than we can use for energy. Your body is constantly exposed to the insulin, and this leads to the insulin resistance and then eventually the diabetes. Now, as your body can't process all the glucose while being exposed to all that insulin, there's nowhere else for the excess glucose to go, so it gets stored as fat. For those of us that, like me, that would do a lot of snacking, that's from the roller coaster of consuming some carbohydrates. Your blood sugar goes way up, your body processes it, it banks and falls all the way down, which stimulates you to have your hunger cravings, so you go ahead and you refill on some carbohydrates and your blood sugar goes up, and then it tries to process it and it comes down, and it leads to all the horrible feelings of, the severe hunger and all the other triggers that come with it. Now, one of the other issues is, while your body is exposed to insulin, all other processes, such as using fat on your body for fuel, is pretty much regulated to being non-functional. So that means while you're exercising and hoping to burn fat, but your body's still high on insulin and high in sugar that needs to be used, any fat burning is going to be something very difficult, if not impossible, to do. So moving on from there, you also have heart disease. The latest studies that are coming out now make it pretty clear, and we can go into this on probably another episode, that contrary to what we were always believed in regards to fats, it's actually the combination of carbohydrates and fats that trigger cholesterol deposits, etc., in the arteries. So it was never fat alone. Carbohydrates are the major component. They can actually take somebody, feed them a certain diet, and once they go ahead and add carbohydrates to the diet is when they can actually see the deposits of cholesterol occurring. Most people are also familiar with triglycerides, which is one of the blood markers you find when you go for checkups at the doctor. And they've also been able to show directly by science that without having the carbohydrates in your diet, that triglycerides will typically come down. So we covered those two, and to go back to insulin for a minute, I do have a personal story that I can share that might shed a little bit of light in regards to how insulin is functioning when we're eating these type of diets. So now that I'm on my new diet, I typically have a very stable and very low blood sugar. I don't get the roller coaster crashes, etc., and we'll get more into that when we go into the diet changes. But when taking my blood sugar, I happened to go up to one of our local restaurants, and that night, which I allow myself cheat days at times, I went ahead and had a slice of cake and a slice of cheesecake. I didn't test my blood sugar at all, which is typically these days around 85 or so, somewhere in the low 80s. And the following day, around 10 o'clock in the morning, I finally decided to take my blood sugar. I was not so shocked, but at the same time really intrigued by the fact that my blood sugar, after probably over 12 hours of my body trying to process the glucose that was in my body, my blood sugar was still 105. So during that entire period of time, anything I would have done to try to burn, I would have had to burn off all of that glucose that was in my bloodstream before I could even try to get to the fat burning part. So are you working out and are you not getting anywhere? Perhaps that's, one of the main reasons why you're stuck, on those different plateaus also. Moving on, we get, if heart disease and diabetes aren't scary enough, there's now a direct link with carbohydrates to cancer. It's been shown in all kinds of different studies that glucose in the body directly feeds tumors in both size and the rate at which they grow. So anybody that has a risk or is concerned about cancer, it's something that you may want to take note of. In fact, I wasn't really even aware until I got into the digging, but certain new tests that attempt to locate the cancer and tumor size in your body are actually completed by injecting you with a glucose solution, because tumors go absolutely bananas over the glucose, and that's how they're then able to locate where the cancer's origin is. So there isn't really much that is much more clear of an answer than that in regards to what glucose does in your body. Those are the main different drawbacks. So now I would like to just get into, well, there's the typical Western diet, so what are you doing now? By now everybody's heard of the ketogenic low carbohydrate diet. They're the same in that you try to get especially refined carbohydrates as low as possible. I've seen everywhere for where people say, well, it's a fad diet, etc. And I think it's important for everybody to realize that this isn't really just a diet sources of food. For example, we've all heard of true fad diets. There's, my gosh, soup diets out there. There's celery diets. There's the all potato diet. Now, those are something that I'd consider to be a little bit more of a fad, because you're simply trying to take normal food choices and you're manipulating your diet around that. When people talk about the ketogenic diet or low carbohydrate diets, you're essentially changing the metabolic process of your body. I've gone over it now that the body will typically and preferentially run off of glucose, but the cool thing about the human body is that in the absence of glucose, your body will actually switch and choose to burn fat. It's not something that's new. When we talk about where does ketogenic diet come from, the name comes from the occurrence of ketones in your body. These are a byproduct of your body using fat for fuel. So when you lower your carbohydrate intake and also be moderate with your protein intake so that you don't get that protein conversion to glucose, your body will switch and it'll run off the fat on your body. When your body's processing fat for fuel, you'll actually release ketones into the bloodstream, and that's one of the main ways, it's essentially the only way to track when you're actually in ketosis. So what would be the purpose of switching to this diet? I do believe it's really quite obvious. It was for me that I didn't like my weight. I didn't like the fact that I was constantly going through the roller coaster of hunger. I didn't like the roller coaster of blood sugar. I didn't like when I would eat my big carbohydrate meals that I'd be exhausted afterwards. And the reality of the ketogenic diet is that when you're burning fat, almost all of that goes away. So you're able to stabilize blood sugar. They're already using this diet to treat type 2 diabetes. It is 100% effective in treating both insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. Why? Because you no longer have that constant bath of insulin in your blood trying to open up those cell pathways to use the glucose for fuel. So I mentioned in my little story about how my blood is different now in regards to when I eat and how my blood sugar changes. So anymore, I can take my blood sugar at almost any time of day, and other than right after I eat my meals, my blood sugar is almost always in the low to mid 80s. It's stable, so I would say the benefits are, the stability in blood sugar, the lack of insulin resistance, because I'm not exposed to really much insulin at all, ever. Mental clarity, because you don't have that roller coaster of hunger and of insulin in your body, so you don't have the fatigue after you eat your meals. And what I always thought when I would try to quote unquote diet before and go just more plant-based is I couldn't do it because I was always starving, and I found it just led me to do all kinds of snacks all the time. And the reality is, now that I'm putting more fats into my diet, I can go between meals because the calories from fat are far more dense than the calories from carbohydrates. So it carries me from one meal to the next. I don't do a whole lot of snacking at all. And literally I'm using the fat on my body for fuel. So if you just sit and imagine to yourself, you don't have insulin there all the time, so your body's constantly searching for a source of fat to use for fuel. So if you're somebody that doesn't like the size you are, and you haven't gotten anywhere by trying to, exercise all day and all night to overcome the glucose intake, then your body is essentially one gigantic fuel source. You don't even have to eat a ton of fats, and it still has all that fat there, and you can be burning fat literally almost around the clock. Drawbacks, I haven't come across any other than becoming slightly bored, because my food choices are a little bit more limited, and that's coming up in regards to how did I start the ketogenic diet and how to be effective with it. So any other drawbacks I've seen aren't really any. I've shed a fair amount of weight. It was almost all fat. I think I look better. I think I am a bit of a better athlete because I'm not carrying all that extra weight. And for me, it's been completely life-changing. Now, obviously, my blood numbers are something that I would have to go into, but at the same time, with all the research I've done, I'm not even all overly concerned, and that will probably be one of the next parts of this episode is why am I not scared to death about my food choices. So, what are my food choices? Aside from the typical Western diet, if you're going to try to get into the ketogenic diet, you have to follow some simple rules. What's usually recommended out there, and I tell everybody almost the same thing, is number one, get yourself a blood monitor. They're pretty cheap. For those that are watching this on YouTube, I'll try to put links in the description. Well, not try, I will, for the blood monitor and strips that I use. The ketone strips can get expensive, but once you get started and you start to realize when your body's in ketosis, which is the process of using fat for fuel and releasing the ketones, and you won't be doing nearly as much testing. I hardly test anymore at all. I can really almost kind of feel when I'm actually in that sweet zone. So, but get the blood monitor. They do have urine strips out there, but those only pick up the very first bits of the process of switching your metabolic process to fats and over to ketones. Once you're actually deeper into ketosis and your body's producing the ketones, you no longer produce the chemical that's picked up on those urine strips. So that's going to go down. You'll probably get depressed, and you won't even realize that you may even be in ketosis and you just don't know it. Once you have your blood and you're able to monitor, it's time to go after your diet, and you are going to have to map this out and measure for at least the first few days. In grams, you want to try to measure and keep yourself to the following. You should have, I tell everybody to, and I follow the same thing, start out with your carbs around 20 grams for the day. And for those that eat a typical Western diet, this may seem absolutely ridiculous, and it is, because there's so many carbohydrates in everything. Anymore, manufacturers add sugar to just about everything in the world, and it's hard to get around. But that's why you're going to be turning. The good thing is, when you're eating carbs and they're plant-based, such as your vegetables, lettuces, broccoli, cauliflower, etc., you can subtract them because they're considered fiber. Fiber is going to pass right through your body. So what you're looking for is your net carbs, which is all of your carbohydrate intake minus all of your fiber equals your net carbs. Go ahead and start with them around 20. And then with your protein intake, so that you don't go overboard, you should have about 1 gram of protein per pound of your target body weight. And then the rest of your intake is going to be from fat. I'll get into the part about fat because I understand everybody right now just went, oh my God, he's eating fat, he's going to die. His heart's going to explode right inside his chest, and we'll cover that. But I want everybody to stay with me. Upwards of 70% of your diet intake may very well come from fats. Now, if you're somebody that's overweight and you have to, you want to get through your body fat, obviously you can reduce that intake quite a bit because you want your body to metabolize the fat on yourself first. So it is true that if you're competing with your body and you're taking in that much fat, that you're kind of fat neutral, you're taking in enough fat and you're only burning a certain amount, you're not going to lose anything because your body, your metabolism hasn't gone after any of the fat on your body. So, start low, but the sources of fat are wonderful. You can go with meat fat, red meat, the fattier cuts of meat. You can go with butter, cream, low-fat milk. There was no reason to go to whole milk because you can have the dairy fats, cheeses, bacon, pork, and a lot of the rest of the bulk of where we get our fats is from different oils. You don't want plant-based oils because they are actually terrible for you. You want things like avocado oil, coconut oil. I actually keep my bacon grease, animal lard, and I use that to saute other things. I went over butter, and these become the basics of your food intake. And then you start to measure. It takes a couple days to even get started, and when you follow along, you can follow along with both your blood sugar measurements and your ketones. What you should start to see, depending on how high your blood sugar typically was, is your blood sugar start to come down and stabilize, and then you'll start to see ketones show up. There are some, I guess this should have been included in the drawbacks section, but some people go through what they call the keto flu, which is just a period where your body kind of feels a little swampy while it's converting over. And the reason for that is because your metabolism is still searching for sugar to use for fuel, and you're not giving it any. So it immediately goes and it uses your muscle glycogen, which is the glycogen stored in your muscles, and also your liver glycogen. And it'll use that up, and you'll kind of be emptied by that a little bit, and you might feel sluggish for a couple days. Some people, it could last up to a week or more, but for me it was pretty much insignificant because I felt sluggish anyway because I constantly was throwing down carbohydrates. So for me, it really wasn't an issue. But once you get into it, then you'll start to enjoy the various benefits, and you just regularly check and see if you're still in ketosis. Now, it can be, I, for example, don't throw out a ton of ketones. I don't know if that's because I wasn't very overweight, but at the same time, my numbers are typically around 0.5. Sometimes it'll get a little bit higher, but typically for people that are going through a lot of fat and have it available on their body, it's, they might be in ketosis and they're, producing something, well over 3 and on their ketones, and it goes from there. So that's the process of getting it started. Okay, so we've reached a point in the podcast where we've gone over all the basics of everything, why in particular I do this, how you can get on the ketogenic diet if you're interested. And I'm sure the moment I got into the specifics about the ketogenic diet, the alarms for everybody started going off, particularly as you even start to approach the idea that you're going to start eating fats, specifically saturated fats. You run into a lot of problems, and just with the beliefs everybody has, and I think this is one of the reasons why a lot of people consider the ketogenic diet a fad diet. It's the interpretation that fats are terrible for you, and that, surely I'm going to die of a heart attack any day now, and cholesterol is going to be through the roof, and heart disease is going to explode, and that this diet will be wiped off the face of the earth in a short amount of time. And I'm hoping we can kind of get into this part of the discussion now, and I really want to approach and try to have everybody open their minds to what if the reason why we have this interpretation and demonizing of fats is because we've all been completely manipulated from the very beginning by the scientific literature regarding the diet. And I think if you're even going to begin to allow that information to come in, I'd like for everybody to just imagine how much do lobby groups influence us today, 2018. I think we'd all say that corporate greed is at an all-time high, and if we're willing to believe that, I would just then extend it to the fact to have everybody realize that probably the most powerful lobby group that ever existed, and the first one to really take hold in America, was the sugar industry. If you go ahead and look at when all these recent diseases of heart disease, obesity, diabetes, they all proliferated at about the time that the sedentary population kind of picked up on this typical Western diet, is the introduction of carbohydrates. So I'm sure everybody's going to say, well, why didn't science pick up and expose the fact that carbohydrates were, the true bad guy in all of this? And it'll go right back to that lobby group. I think, the sugar industry has always been able to skirt around even being considered a lobby group, for the simple fact that they produce and endorse a product that people love. It's completely different. I think it's easy, for example, if you look at tobacco, and I don't think anybody is really shocked when you say that big tobacco was able to manipulate science and have them as a demon, because tobacco is considered gross. And it's completely different for the sugar industry, because they produce a product that we love, makes people happy. We've already proven, from the history of sugar intake, of how much it's increased. When you go back to World War I and World War II, people would be willing to give up food so they could continue to go to their local establishment and get a Coca-Cola. So this is something that humans in general immediately were attracted to, and that's the reason why it's in everything today. And so how did they get their foot in the door to get all this control? So if you go back, it was really the early 1900s is when they started to make their money. You can trace back to when Hershey Foods, Nabisco, all the different companies that exist today started to mass produce foods and treats that people loved. They all started to band together into the sugar foundation, the sugar industry. So heart disease itself, in the beginning of the 20th century, wasn't a major problem. It started to creep along, and it wasn't until the president had a heart attack in the 1950s that really alarm bells started to sound. You're talking about the leader of our country. It's the first time something like that had occurred, and obviously the government immediately reached out to science to try to get some sort of answer for what just happened. Now, the person that is kind of at the hallmark of how our views on diet shifted is a person called Ansel Keys. Ansel Keys was not a doctor. He wasn't a registered dietitian. He was essentially a self-taught biologist almost that got into research, got intrigued, and kind of became a passion of his life. Now, there's a lot of history can be found about Ansel Keys. Most of it tailors around the idea that he was incredibly driven, incredibly focused, and incredibly passionate about his different work. So when he gets into diet, obviously, even though he wasn't a doctor, he tries to get into this really deep. So now what isn't often released is that Ancel Keys came to notoriety with the government because he was the person that developed the K-ration. If anybody recognizes K-ration, it is the kind of ready-made meals that our soldiers and military personnel eat in the field. So he's awarded the contract to provide all these meals. The K and K-ration is for Keys, so that's where this all comes from. What a lot of history doesn't talk about is the fact that Keys' research into developing the K-rations was also supported by the sugar industry. It's not a hidden fact that K-rations are incredibly high in calories. It was almost necessary just for their purpose of being the main ration for our military personnel. And the easiest way that they found to get the calorie numbers extremely high was to add a lot of sugar. So you've already got Ancel Keys and the sugar industry tied together as he's producing these for the government. So we move forward, and the president has a heart attack, and they went ahead and turned to their nutrition guy that was developing things already for the government's military. So they go to Ancel Keys and they say, hey, find out what's going on here. So Keys takes some information at the time. There wasn't a whole lot of research into heart disease back then. There was a few minor studies that were found with rabbits and things like that, but nothing that was really in-depth clinical research or data that was being produced. So Keys is able to kind of start from scratch and develop his own hypothesis with just some of this small amount of research going on. And his first idea is he looks at diet, and he's obviously not going to target sugar. Or is it even more nefarious than that? Does the sugar industry actually instruct Keys to specifically target opponents that are, stealing some of the cut of available money? And do they tell him to go after fats directly? I don't know if that's ever going to be found. There is exposure today about some Harvard scientists that were paid off by the sugar industry to manipulate data. I don't know if that goes all the way back to Keys, but for whatever reason, Keys decides, and he develops his own hypothesis that it's the intake of saturated fat and cholesterol is the reason why this heart disease happens. He develops, and he goes out and produces a study. It's called the 7-country study. Essentially, this was where he went to 7 different countries, and he monitored their food intake, and he was able to supposedly put together a curve that showed with a certain amount of saturated fat intake, the risk of heart disease went up, and he decided and published that there was a correlation that saturated fats were the cause of heart disease. What was never exposed at the time was the fact that Keys didn't just go to 7 countries. He actually used this almost as vacations with his wife, and together they went to 22 countries, but he only used 7 countries for his published work. As the story goes, if you actually take all 22 countries and you put all of those numbers for fat intake and mortality onto a graph, there is absolutely no curve at all. So it's reasonable to suspect that the only reason why it ended as a 7-country study was because it gave the data the outcome that he was looking for. And this is one of the problems with science, is sometimes researchers get so in depth with believing their cause that they develop the data to just fulfill that cause. So besides just possibly being wrong, it's also important to note that this was never clinical data. This didn't show causation, ever. In fact, I'm not aware in any of the research I did that any studies have ever been produced that specifically show causation. So what's the difference? If I'm running clinical research and I have a stable environment and you give specifically product A and it produces result A, and you can replicate that, you've gone a good path down the road to showing causation. Correlation simply means you took a set of data, you observed it, and among all other factors which could be influential, you think this has some sort of input on the final result. That's simply, could they be correlated? Yes. Is this the definite cause? Unknown. So there's a gigantic scientific difference between causation and correlation. So Keyes never was able to develop that. He moves forward with this. The president immediately changes his diet to a plant-based diet, and even though he did all that, subsequently dies. So it doesn't help the president at the time, but nobody seemed to really be all that worried about that. And why? Because other means were sought in order to continue to proliferate what was considered the diet heart hypothesis of the demonization of saturated fats. So Keyes publishes his study, and the first thing that the American Heart Association does is they put out a response in 1955 that is extremely critical of Keyes' work, and they say, exactly what the holes in were that I just described, that this is simply correlation, that it's very important to note that it's not possible to determine if this is actual causation, and they basically recommend that it be very cautious to take this as any kind of valid proof of anything. So why didn't it stop there? Whether it was backed by the sugar industry or whatnot, I can't find that out. But what I do know is that in 1957, Ancel Keys and a partner of his are able to get onto the board at the American Heart Association. And within 2 years, from 1955, when they first gave a statement of caution to Keyes' work, by 1957, with Keyes on the actual board, they do a 180-degree turn, and they implement this diet heart hypothesis as the contributing factor for heart disease, and it becomes kind of the national standard. The American Heart Association at the time was the gold standard, obviously, for heart recommendations for this newest disease that was starting to become a major problem, and it kind of solidified itself there. Now it's interesting because, once again, you're only talking about one lobby group and one person that's driving this, but you do now have a whole board that is putting this as their mission and causation of heart disease. But it's amazing because it goes even further from there. It's important to note that saturated fats didn't really have a lobby group. Most people at the time got their fats from the local butcher shops, where they were able to just pick up animal lard. There was no reason to have a company producing it or anything like that. So at the parallel time, while you have Ancel Keys and the sugar industry making an assault on fats, you have other corporate interests start to catch wind and start to get the idea that, hey man, saturated fats are ripe for the picking. Let's wedge ourselves into the profits of people's diets. So you can move on now to other companies, most specifically vegetable oil companies. If you go all the way back to the history to, for example, Procter & Gamble, they were simply a company making soaps and things like that at the time, and they were also selling different vegetable oils that were a byproduct of these products that we were making, and they were basically waste oils. So they were actually cotton oil, soybean oil, things like that were actually getting sold as lubricants for mechanical industries, and there wasn't really a tremendous market for that. It certainly wasn't reaching everybody in the country. So Procter & Gamble were the ones that decided to take a hit at saturated fats while they were already kind of being knocked off their pedestal, and they were able to develop Crisco. It was the hydrogenation of oil that allowed them to be able to develop a lard-like substance And they went on a heavy marketing campaign to women at the time because there were some issues with lard. It was obviously not a sexy product. When you cooked with it, it was kind of smoky and had an odor and everything else. So as they developed Crisco, this firm hydrogenated oil, they made their marketing pitch to housewives and said, how cooking in the kitchen would become a clean process. They showed very high upscale women using the product. And all of a sudden, we've got all these oils that have a brand new market. And they can start getting pitched to all the different households in America. People loved it. Oil took off. And now, obviously, if you look at almost any recommendation, you will find that soybean oil, canola oil, all these different oils are always pitched and are made out to be great products. Now, obviously, margarine was a major factor in that, and science has finally caught up and found out that all these hydrogenated oils, which have actually been banned, are actually a huge part of the problem. But we've got so many decades ingrained in people that it's almost an uphill battle to try to walk it back from there, especially with companies still promoting and producing and pitching these items. So you can go once again back to the American Heart Association, and I was talking about the 1950s when they first came out with their recommendations, and why has science still not been able to overcome any of this? And it's important to note that the American Heart Association runs mostly off of donations. So go to your local supermarket and notice all the different labels on products right now. In order to get a low-fat tag onto a product, you can make a donation to the American Heart Association. They will sell you that label if you meet a certain criteria for a certain amount of fat threshold, and they can make a ton of money that way. It's supported by the sugar industry still, with all the different companies. You can get low fat put onto a box of cereal that's almost all sugar, but it gets that low fat mark. It's incredibly profitable. They have no necessary dedication to scientific integrity. They are not a group that has any ties to any kind of independence at all. That's all been washed under the rug. So we just spoke about the demonization of saturated fats. So the conclusion of all this will be where exactly is the science now on saturated fats and also cholesterol. The most recent science that has actually been focused around clinical research, as opposed to just the kind of studies that Keyes did, has made some very interesting and exciting discoveries. It's now believed, with the research available, that it's not necessarily the fats that we eat that create heart disease. I'd like everybody to once again have an open mind and just think about this critically and logically. Humans have been eating fats forever. Our bodies are clearly able to do two different kinds of fuels for metabolization for energy. There's a reason why it's evolved into what humans are. The only thing humans have never been exposed to until the last few hundred years was the constant supply of carbohydrates. They're taking people right now in heart studies, and you feed them saturated fats, and all-cause mortality, which means, what are they dying from, doesn't significantly change from people that are simply eating plants. They do, however, have clinical data showing that it's when you introduce carbohydrates into the diet along with fats that major problems happen. And I think this is completely logical with what we see happening today with the typical Western diet. Why does it go hand in hand with heart disease, diabetes, cancer, obesity? It's not because, I often see, well, why are Amish people different? Well, it's because they work out in the fields all the time. Well, not only that, but they never really transitioned away from eating butter, from drinking and using cream, from drinking whole milk. It's when we went on to all this fat-free things and replaced it with high fructose corn syrup in every manageable product in the world in our grocery stores over here in the West, that we have all these issues. So my recommendation, as not a doctor, is simply going to be, you can't go halfway into the ketogenic diet. You can't just say, well, I'm going to, eat all these fats and just kind of lower my carbs a little bit. You've got to go on a low carb or ketogenic diet and get rid of the carbs, or please don't go eating the fats. With the data, the research that I've been able to come across, it's when you combine these two that inflammation occurs in your arteries. In these inflammation areas, cholesterol is deposited and you can have tons of problems. So if you're going to, I had been talking with a friend before and he was kind of on the fence trying it, but his blood numbers got incredibly bad. And I think that kind of falls into what that data says, that when you combine the two, especially high levels of both, you're going to be in a whole world of trouble. So please don't do that. But in regards to cholesterol, which I've barely touched in any of this, that's going to be its whole other podcast, because when I started doing the research for this podcast, really the rabbit hole of cholesterol is almost as deep as the rabbit hole on sugar. So I think I'm going to go ahead and dedicate a podcast to each of them and give each its weight. However, going over cholesterol briefly, sometimes when I post photos of what I'm eating to give people ideas of how they can get some meals put together for the ketogenic diet, I understandably get the feedback of, are you not worried about the cholesterol? And cholesterol was put forth as the demon going right back to Ansel Keys. They were looking for a fall guy, and they found two fall guys, fats and cholesterol. And it's important for everybody to know that the latest research has proven that dietary cholesterol, the cholesterol that you eat, has essentially no impact on your serum cholesterol, which is your blood cholesterol. In fact, I believe I have the dates, and I know I've gotten some of the dates in this entire podcast wrong. Fact finders can start picking it apart. But I believe it was 2014 or 2015 that dietary cholesterol was taken off of risk factors. Everything from Weight Watchers to the American Heart Association, there is now no dietary restrictions on the amount of cholesterol you eat. There are none. What we are doing right now is we've made it law that hydrogenated fats have to be taken out of restaurants. And because we're looking at the realization over who really are the bad guys. So you can feel safe to eat eggs every day. You could have eggs every meal. There were some studies being done at the time of Ansel Keys by people that didn't believe them, that were snuffed out, where people would eat upwards of 6 to 12 eggs a day. And there was only a short rise in serum cholesterol and an immediate fall soon after, because there is no impact. They're an incredible part of the diet. They're an incredible part of the diet for people that are even possibly, can you do even this diet if you want to try to be vegan? To a large part you can. Lots of fibrous plants, especially greens, kales, spinach, lettuces, broccoli, cauliflower. The difference is, are you willing to put some oils on them? Coconut oil, avocado oil, butter, etc., to get those fats. But eggs are a wonderful choice. They're not harming to any animal whatsoever. They were not fertilized to begin with. They're simply a byproduct of what a hen is going to do anyway. But they're really an incredible source of fuel, not only for this diet, but for overall health. So that's a wrap. That's the ketogenic diet. Like I said in the beginning, I wanted to make this brief. I think I held it to under an hour. I did it in different segments while I was traveling in different places. I tried to just knock some things out. So if the flow of this doesn't seem to have complete direction all the time, it was made up of, I think, four segments that I did. But obviously I didn't cover a ton of things, but I think it's a good opportunity just to start to absorb just what in the world this diet is. I figure I think it would be a really fun time to do a live question and answer on Facebook or YouTube or both, and go over, for example, maybe what my meals look like or something like that, and people can start to fine tune. But to go over what I said in the beginning, if you want to start this, get yourself a food scale. They're about $10 on Amazon. Get yourself the blood meter. They're about $45 on Amazon. If you get ketone strips, blood strips, they're going to be about $20 for a supply of maybe about 3 weeks. If you test every day, maybe it's about 18 to 20 strips you get out of it. And if you're going to go for this, give it a legitimate shot before you say, I like it, I don't like it, it's not for me. And to be honest, even people that get into ketosis and follow this 100%, their bodies may not simply be evolved and programmed for it. We do come from different regions of the world, areas developed on different diets, but there is absolutely no person other than a small segment of people that can have cholesterol issues regardless, that your bodies will run on these two different fuels. And if you're not happy with where you're at and you want to try something different, I think this is the most exciting thing to occur in quite a long time. To date, after about 6 months, I've shed about 25 pounds of pure fat. I feel great. I'm still doing all the athletic things that I'm doing. In fact, I feel better. When I, for example, go to play basketball, and even if I'm just running a pickup game, midway through, I would often be starving if I hadn't eaten and dumped myself a lot of carbs. And to be honest, I now don't even necessarily eat within a window of going to play. And I just feel like my body carries itself and runs off a different fuel as I get through that. And then I simply can replenish it elsewhere. I don't need to eat as much during the day. We'll get into something called intermittent fasting, which I think complements the ketogenic diet perfectly, or it can be done on its own, but I think the two go hand in hand really, really well. I'm down to eating 2 meals a day, and I have no problem at all working out, keeping weight, feeling energetic, and I eat between the windows of 12 o'clock in the afternoon and 8 o'clock at night. I allow myself to deviate from that, and by all means, I'll just throw this in at the end. Switching over to the ketogenic diet doesn't mean that you've said goodbye to carbs forever. When I'm talking to somebody, the first thing I usually say is, never am I going to not allow myself to have a cheat day, because I think experiencing foods, and especially foods that you like, there's nothing wrong with it. When I talk about mixing carbohydrates and fats as being a bad idea, I think that's absolutely true, but you're not talking about do it long term. If you want to go out for a bender one night and have a couple beers and some cake and some pie, you can do it. I've even found that now that I'm truly fat adapted and running off of fats the majority of the time, is I can take way more than 20 grams of carbohydrates and remain in ketosis. So I can be flexible with it. If you decide on a Saturday night that you're going to go and have, French fries and a cheesesteak, that doesn't mean that you're completely starting over and you're going to have to go through the keto flu all over again and everything like that. You just go ahead and make that your one night of enjoyment. And on the following day, you get right back into your fasting window and your food choices to get you right back into the fat adapted state. And you typically will fall into it very quickly. So it's not something that's like a prison sentence, but I don't know how you could find a prison sentence to begin with when your food choices are as varied as eggs, bacon, vegetables, high-fat dressings that can go on them, cream cheese, heavy whipped cream, coffee, tea, obviously just with no sugar added to those. But you can get sweeteners like stevia if you definitely need some sort of sweetness. But meats of different kinds, oils that are full and full of flavor and everything else. It's avocados. You name it. You have decent food choices, and you got to break from it every now and then. But you do have some really decadent things that are something that we've been told forever are bad for us, and I don't believe they are. So if you've gotten this far, thanks for listening. You can start piling up questions here if you want, and maybe I'll make that part of a list that I'll do for my Facebook Live. If you like this podcast, I'm sending it out first on Anchor, which will be my first podcast ever on it. I'm also going to attempt to double broadcast by putting it on YouTube. So by whatever means you can, if you're able to subscribe, that would be great. Notification buttons are on YouTube if you want to get notified when I do additional videos. And if you like the video, obviously hit like. And you can also ask questions or even start sending in ideas for other topics. I like to learn. By learning, I do research. When I'm stimulated to do research, I enjoy sharing it with other people. So get out there, use your head, and don't let other companies or people, tell you what's real. Thanks.